Welcome to BQ Prime. The inflation number for April at 7.8% has reinforced the problem that the Indian economy is facing. It's not just headline inflation that's now at an 8-year high. Core inflation is also at about an 8-year high. Pressures coming in from food, fuel, and also a wider set of goods. Joining us to help us talk through what's actually going on the inflation front, what the response would look like, and what the implications for the economy would be. Pranjul Bhandari, Chief India Economist at HSBC. Pranjul, thanks so much for taking the time to speak to us.
Great to be here, Ira.
Pranjul, I will start with yesterday's number. I think people feared that it would be bad, and the way the RBI and the MPC had acted, it seemed like we were preparing ourselves for a rough number. Was the message in that number broadly that generalized inflation is here, or at least it is becoming more generalized than what one would have assumed a few months back, and pressures are no longer just coming from food and fuel?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I would say that the year-on-year number was 7.8. But if you look at the sequential momentum, which technically we call the quarter-on-quarter annualized, was actually 9%. So it was even higher than the number we saw, come out yesterday. Across the board pressures, food, fuel, core. And interestingly, if you sort of pass through the details, you also realize that this is not the end of it. As in, there's going to be a lot of upward pressure even now, because a lot of the pass-through still remains, it still is not complete. So this, is a problem number. I must say here that the next 2 months readings, May and June, will be lower. It'll probably be closer to 7 and not 7.8, simply because of base effects. And then once, May and June have passed, then the numbers could jump back up again. So, don't get very comforted just because May and June will come out lower.
I just want to unpack, various aspects of this number, and let me start with food. One part of it has been the edible oil story, certainly. There would be some summer volatility involved in it as well. But now we're starting to see cereals go up too, at least, wheat go up because of what's happened in Ukraine, Russia. Is the food price story now very broad-based? Are most items rising? How much of that is, short-term volatility? How much of that, seems like it's going to be longer-term pressure?
Some of it is going to be across the board. As in, agricultural input costs have increased 15% year-on-year in its last reading. That's considerable. And it's going to be across all food items. So, one is across the board. But I think for me, the most worrying part has been what's happened to cereal. Because remember, cereal inflation has been under control for several years and has been sort of the main driver of low food inflation in India for a very long time. And I think this is what changed. In fact, a lot of people ask what prompted the RBI to give this surprise hike suddenly. And I think the fact that the food inflation bit was changing a lot. You see, I think the story here is that we were thinking up till March that, we have a very good wheat crop, we can feed the world, we can export. And then suddenly you get that heat wave, the wheat crop has shriveled at a time when the stocks at the FCI are not as elevated as they were 2 years ago, at a time when flour millers are not being able to import from Ukraine and Russia. There is a wheat problem. And now looking ahead, rice and wheat are close substitutes. So a lot of pressure is on rice crop to do well. But in case the monsoon rains don't turn out well, in case we have some fertilizer shortage and we have some problem with the rice crop, then I think, things could be worse than what they are right now. Hopefully we won't get there. But I think cereal inflation is really very important to watch. So to a short answer to your question, I think it's across the board, but I'm particularly worried about cereal inflation at this point.
So, on that cereal inflation part, there is scope for intervention, right? I mean, not to suggest that we, stop and start on agricultural policies. None of us would advocate it. But given the current inflation scenario, the government probably has the ability to keep a close watch on exports, wheat, perhaps put in some limits if it goes out of control, throw some wheat into the market to try and control any sort of, any price rises which are happening due to speculation. Do we not have the ability to control that quite quickly on the supply side?
I think we have the ability to control it if the rice crop is a good crop. If the rice crop is a good crop, then we can control a little bit of, substituting wheat with rice, some small changes in export-import policy, making bilateral agreements with other wheat sellers around the world. I think we can control it. Yes, you're right. I think the problem would be if the rice crop disappoints us. I think then we will we will be in problem area.
Also, there is that expanded free food program underway. So that perhaps means that the demand from the government side is also a little bit more at this point.
Yes, that's correct. But the other way to think about it is that they've announced it for 6 months. But if they see some shortages around along the way, they could go slow.
Just moving now to the fuel component, this was also the month in which we saw a lot of the sort of punched up hikes on petrol and diesel come through. But even some of the other products, kerosene, for instance, is running at 90% sort of inflation compared to a year ago.
Yes, I think the fuel story is a very interesting one. We're seeing, so we know what we talk about a lot is the pump petrol and diesel prices. So we know what's going on there. They increased, but alongside kerosene, which is the main lighting fuel in rural India, is non-regulated, so it follows market prices, market cues. That has really shot up. The other thing that has shot up is bulk diesel, again something used a lot in rural India to work agricultural pumps. That shot up too. So we've seen these parts of the fuel basket, which the rural Indians use to a large extent, shoot up pretty aggressively. But on the other hand, if you look at electricity tariffs, they haven't really gone up yet. Generally, electricity tariffs, which are dictated by the discoms, take about 12 to 18 months to be revised. And that's a bigger part of urban inflation. And I think this fuel story, the fact that kerosene and bulk diesel have gone up, but electricity tariffs haven't gone up yet, is the main reason today why rural inflation is so much higher than urban inflation. I think this is sort of an important point to keep in mind, because eventually when electricity tariffs are increased, then urban inflation will begin to catch up. And once urban inflation begins to catch up, the urban purchasing power, which has been a main driver of growth right now, will begin to sort of moderate a bit, and that will have growth implications.
Since you mentioned the rural versus urban sort of gap between inflation, again, coming at a bad time. You've been writing consistently about rural demand. Wages have not really picked up very much. So high inflation, coming from food, fuel, which are the largest parts of their consumption basket, will probably dampen demand there.
Yes, I think rural, unfortunately, hasn't been doing well since the middle of last year. And many things have sort of coincided, starting from volatile rains last year to the Narega support being a little lesser than people had anticipated. No big increases in PM Kisan after the first sort of lot. Construction demand, again, being a bit volatile because of volatile rains. So a lot of things came together, high rural inflation. Unfortunately, the pressures remain there. The one silver lining is wheat exports, the fact that rural Indians are being able to export and earn some extra money. But now, there's a problem with the quantity of wheat available because of the shriveled crop. So we'll see how it goes. Generally speaking, rural demand is weak. I would watch out for two things. Number one, monsoon rains. If they are good, maybe we'll see some improvement in rural India. And the other thing I'll watch out for is construction. If over time construction activity picks up, especially in urban India, and that's a main source of wages for rural Indians now, then maybe we can see the rural fortunes turn. But for now, it is not looking very good.
Pranjul, just turning focus now to the core inflation part. What's the story playing out there? The core inflation spiked in this reading as well.
Yes, exactly. With such big increases in input costs, of course, at some point, producers have to pass it on to consumers, and that's what we are seeing. The core inflation pressures were across the board. Personal goods, household services. So it's across the board. It's understandable, but my worry here remains that the pass through from producers to consumers is still about 50 to 60% of what is generally passed on, when input prices are rising. And in fact, if I drill in deeper, it seems to me that for goods inflation, for goods producers, a lot of the pass through has happened, but for services producers, a lot of the pass through has still not happened. And when that picks up, my worry is that core inflation could sort of could remain sticky for longer. The other worry on the core front is that through the pandemic, we've seen, formalization, and we've also seen large firms getting larger. We've seen large firms gaining pricing power. Once they've increased prices because input costs went up, they get comfortable with those prices. And even if at some point input costs go down, they don't cut as fast as they raised the prices that they passed on to consumers. So that's another sort of source of stickiness that we may see in core inflation.
That's interesting. So, just for the, if one goes back to theory and, being that, okay, if you have a wide output gap, you will not see core inflation rise that quickly because, pass through would be difficult. Demand conditions are weak. Why is that story not playing out right now in India?
Yeah, that's a great question. As in, even before global inflation began to rise in 2021, right through 2020, we had core inflation in India, which was quite elevated. So what was really going on at a time? Growth was, negative double digits. Well, I think the story is very sort of India-centric. I think there were two forces at play. One force was what was happening to the small firms, and the other one was what was happening to the big firms. Small firms saw a lot of disruption. They have low cash buffers. When there were lockdowns, many of them were forced to shut down, and there was a disruption in supply. We also see that many of the small informal firms are actually producers of necessary goods like clothes, food items, for which the demand didn't really fall very much. So if the supply fell because these firms went out of business, it basically meant high prices. So that was one source of high core inflation coming from small firms. The story was exactly the opposite for the large firms, which, as I explained, have gained pricing power and generally kept prices higher than they could have. And that was another contributor to core inflation. And I think that's why we saw high core inflation through the pandemic period.
So just to stitch together a couple of things you said, if the pass-through is still incomplete and this output gap story is not really playing out as it would be expected to, sequential momentum over the next couple of months, you're saying would remain high, even though the headline numbers would start to come off a bit.
Yes. Look, it's sort of hard for me to forecast whether it will sort of go higher because there's just so many moving parts. I don't know what's going to happen to global commodity prices, to monsoon rains. But my sense is they will remain at current levels for a fairly long time, perhaps all of this year.
Pranjul, so if one speaks now about the policy response, we've already seen the Reserve Bank of India and the MPC sort of start to act. Would you anticipate that they would have to keep reacting to these numbers going ahead, even though some of these pressures may not actually be something within the realm of monetary policy or the control of monetary policy?
Yes, I think it's very important to be clear upfront what the RBI is capable of doing with monetary policy and what is beyond their control. I think what's beyond their control is the source of the shock, as in the source of the shock is a supply shock. Some of it has come from global commodity prices. Some of it has come from other factors such as heat waves. Let's see how the monsoon progresses. None of that can be changed by the RBI. So we have to be very clear about that. But what RBI can do is to take care of some of the second round effects. And that is what the RBI is trying to do. Second round effects control is never full. It's always, part, particularly in a country like India, where we have such a large informal sector. And it also has huge transmission lags. It has about 2 to 3 quarters. Our best hope is that the RBI removes some of the extraordinary accommodation of the pandemic period. And that helps bring down inflation expectations, or rather keeps inflation expectations from rising too much. And that becomes a primary tool of inflation control. Another tool of inflation control is that as you keep hiking rates, the demand for credit comes down, and therefore, inflation associated with that also comes down. But here, RBI will have to tread a really fine line. As in, I think it's very important at this point to remove the extraordinary accommodation. It's very important to take real rates out of the negative terrain where savers are getting hugely punished. But how positive do you want to drive it? Do you want to go all the way up to where you think neutral real rates are? Or do you want to stay a little under that? And my sense is that, RBI may want to stay a little under neutral real rates. And in that sense, striking a balance between both, growth and inflation.
What is the neutral real rate right now?
So that's a tough one. Yeah. So the neutral real rate before the pandemic was just above 1%. By RBI's own research. My sense it's let's see, after all the rate hikes around the world, it's about there. My own terminal rate forecasts, which is 6% repo rate by June 2023, implies for me that they will take India's real repo rate to 0.5, which is basically just under 1. So that's what I'm forecasting at this point, and for me that is the fine balancing line. So just to sort of make it a bit more clear, right now the repo rate is 4.5. I think there will be a couple of pit stops. The first pit stop would be to cross 5.15, which is where the repo rate was at the start of the pandemic, which I think they will sort of achieve by end September. The next pit stop would be taking it to 5.5. This is an important number for me because my 1 year ahead inflation forecast for FY24 is 5.5. So taking the repo rate to 5.5 means that you're finally coming out of negative real rates. And I think we will reach repo rate of 5.5% by December 2022. And once we reach there, my sense is RBI will take a very careful look at growth. If growth allows, they will hike a little more. And my sense is they move from 5.5 to 6. And at 6, they would be just under, neutral real rates.
What's the growth trade-off, Pranjul? There will be one if you're hiking rates in quick succession at a time when, in any case, impulses are fairly weak.
Well, look, yes, but this is a hard question, Ira. We always think that low rates, bring growth. But we've also seen in India's case that low rates were not able to trigger the private capex cycle as many had hoped, at least in previous cycles. So this is a tough one. I do think that, very high rates at some point will start hurting growth, but the rate hikes I am talking about right now are just about taking India to a safe territory, taking India towards positive real rates, which I think is necessary to have sustainable GDP growth.
The only sort of difference between the previous cycle and now is that, now, and we've discussed this in the past, that some of the twin balance sheet overhangs, etc., had gone, and the hope was that, you'll finally see credit start picking up as demand starts strengthening. Will the rate hiking cycle damage that a little bit, and hence sort of, prevent a pickup in the economy that could have happened should rates have stayed low?
I've looked at this very carefully. My sense is at this point, the biggest dampener to private capex is not rates, and it's not even like, liquidity withdrawal. It is economic uncertainty. The fact that, we are finding it very hard to forecast growth, inflation, commodity prices with a huge level of confidence. At this point, there's so many moving parts around the world. And I think when you see this kind of economic uncertainty, the first thing to retract is private capex. And I think that's the biggest problem right now. If, I think of a hypothetical situation in which this economic uncertainty goes out of the window, but rates are a little higher, my sense is we would start seeing private capex pick up.
Pranjul, where does the global rate hiking cycle sort of fit into our story? While we were perhaps reacting to the April number coming up and the sequential momentum in inflation locally, there is also a very steep rate hiking cycle underway in developed economies, and I presume we can't stay sort of counter to that.
Yes, absolutely, and that's what we reacted to, I suppose. I think the timing of the surprise rate hike in June, just a couple of hours before the Fed meeting, had to do something with the global hiking cycle. So absolutely, we are seeing the pressures on the rupee, as in everything, the cutting cycle was coordinated, the hiking cycle is coordinated, driven by all the global changes that are happening. So absolutely. But, at some point, we have to sort of see our own trade-off between growth and inflation. As in, if you think of some of the developed economies, they have very tight labor markets. Our labor markets are not as tight, as in pockets of it are tight, as in, IT and all of that are tight, yes. But a lot, big chunks of the labor market are still seeing, low wage growth, are still seeing, unemployment, are still seeing disguised unemployment. The fact that a lot of people look employed, but they're not really employed, they're not earning a decent wage. So, that is something we don't have. So while on the one hand, we have to remove extraordinary accommodation from our, monetary policy, we'll have to be careful about how much we want to tighten in this cycle.
Fair enough. Pressures from the external front, yes, some visible on the rupee, but sort of not to the extent that we've seen in past inflation episodes or past global tightening episodes. But still, it's going to be a trade-off for the RBI between the currency markets, the bond markets, the possible trinity in many ways.
Yes, it'll. Yeah, it's not easy times at all for any central bank and the RBI. But my sense is you can sort of you can sort of hobble along doing a little bit of a lot of things, and I think by that I mean that look, they're intervening in the FX market. They're so via that route they're draining out some rupee liquidity, and that's creating some space which they may use a little later for doing OMO bond purchases, and through that route help the bond market. Meanwhile, they're actually using the CRR route to remove some of the permanent liquidity from the system, and they're raising rates to remove extraordinary accommodation. So they're doing a lot of things, and I think this is what will have to happen because there are just many objectives. When you have many objectives, you need many instruments. Thankfully, the RBI has many instruments. There are repo rate hikes, there are CRR hikes, there are dollar sales, there are bond purchases, and then at some point they will just have to find the best sort of framework in which all of this fits together. I'm quite sure there won't be just one framework that stays the whole year. They'll have to continuously sort of re-engineer it. But what gives me comfort is that the RBI has enough instruments in its hand.
Pranjul, we spoke briefly about supply side response on food, but more broadly, is there a scope for wider sort of government intervention in this inflation picture? Fuel we've discussed in the past; they haven't given up on the excise. I know there's been back and forth between states and the central government. Food again, are those two areas where they can potentially intervene? Although things like edible oil, etc., I don't even know if they want to, whether they can do very much more.
Look, we are confronted by a large wave. Of course, we can try and help on the margin, but you can't fight the entire wave. As in, there is nothing that policymakers can do to completely sort of offset this entire inflationary wave we are facing. So let's be clear about that. But having said that, there are lots of things they can do in the margin. As in, one thing that has become extremely popular now is to sort of reach out and do bilateral agreements. As in, news articles on conversations with Indonesia on edible oil imports from there, conversations from some countries on wheat imports, if at some point we reach that state, on oil purchases, on oil contracts. As in, there's just a lot of small things that we can do, and we should continue to do that. But my worry is that that's not good enough to sort of offset this entire inflation wave.
Question then, Pranjul, what have I missed in terms of red flags that you think need to be watched out for? And on the flip side, is the big positive only, in the form of the Russia-Ukraine crisis abating? But even if it does, I'm not sure how quickly some of the issues that have come up post that crisis will actually start to wind down.
Yeah, so look, I think the worry is, I think monsoons, we've just had this completely unexpected heat wave in March. And every monsoons or, while we sort of call it normal by the time it ends, but while it's progressing, it doesn't feel normal. Huge volatility, huge geographical discrepancy, and all of that can really impact some of our crops. So, that's sort of one area to watch out for. You told me both negative and positive, so that's on the negative side. But on the positive side, and I really wanted to bring this up too, I think there are a lot of good things happening in the economy as well. As in last 2 years, while we were in lockdown, what I call new India, some of the new sectors did start growing very rapidly. And I feel like once we are over this current problem we are in, I feel excited about India's GDP growth prospects in the 3 to 5 year horizon. I'm particularly excited about high skill exports, not just IT services, but, mobile handsets, drugs and pharma, auto, specialized machinery. I'm also excited about digital firms, the fact that, they're sort of bringing this whole entrepreneurial culture in the economy, which has been the secret sauce of many economies that have grown for at a high clip for many years. And then the final one is green transition, as in the opportunities it brings in terms of solar, green hydrogen, capex. There's a lot of stuff to look forward to on the growth front. And I'm just hoping that, we're able to fight the ongoing battles and, get to that part, the 3 to 5 year horizon, which looks more exciting to me than the current is looking.
perhaps if we just avoid policy mistakes in this period, we'd be able to sort of get to that part a little bit quicker.
Yeah, that's probably the most important part, which I purposely avoided.
All right. Pranjul, always lovely to talk to you. Thank you for taking the time.
Thanks, Hira.
Thanks for watching me.